All right, so classical era, we are in chapter 6, and this is part 2, and it's going to cover Greece. And you can tell the difference between the Greek and the Roman buildings because the Greeks use straight columns, and then the Romans eventually are going to use the arch. So Greece, and here's the Parthenon, what it looked like back, before what it looks like today. All right, so the glory of Greece, their geography kind of sets them apart from everywhere else. So ancient Greece consisted of a large mountainous peninsula and the islands of out in the Aegean Sea, and then the coast of present-day Turkey. So it's kind of spread out throughout a different area. Because of Greece's hilly terrain, farming the land was very difficult, and much of Greece is stony, and it's only suitable for pasture. In other words, goats, sheep, things like that. So as people came to rely on trade. So instead of farming like everybody else we talked about, they traded more than anything else. So the Greeks did produce wine, olive oil, and pottery, and which they traded with people throughout the Mediterranean. So that's why they needed shipbuilders and things like that, because their trade was throughout the Mediterranean. So through these contacts, the Greeks became exposed to the key achievements of ancient civilizations. Such as the alphabet, which they get from the Phoenicians, and it's really still the same type of alphabet that we use today, using phonics and things like that. So here's a good picture of the area of Greece, and this is what the terrain is going to look like. This is the original area. So you have the islands out here in the Aegean Sea. You have some settlements over here in Asia Minor, which is Turkey, the main peninsula. So it starts off in a small area. And then eventually you see they just kind of colonized throughout the different areas around the Mediterranean and who they traded with, Carthage and places like that. So early Greek civilization. So the Minoan civilization flourished on the island of Crete from 2000 BC to 1400 BC. They developed their own form of writing. They used copper and bronze, and they were skilled at shipbuilding, which makes sense, being starting on an island. And then you had the mysterious collapse in 1400 BC, which kind of lends the rumor of lost civilizations and things like that. Atlantis being one. So a second ancient Greek civilization known as Mycenae on the mainland of Greece and on the coast of Asia Minor kind of took over at this time. And at this time, the Dorians, a group of people from northern Greece, came in and conquered pretty much all of the Greek mainland. So these are the early groups, the Minoans, and then your Dorians. So this is the city of Mycenae, the main city. Man, this is what it would have looked like back in the day, and this is the ruins today. And you can see they were really good at stone masonry and cutting stones and things like that. So the rise of the Greek city-states. So mountains and the sea caused the Greek centers of population to be cut off from one another. So when you're cut off from other groups, you develop your own culture. So as a result, separate city-states developed, and each one had its own form of government, had its own system of laws. And in Greek, the word for city is polis, and that's what we use today for some of the areas, Indianapolis, metropolis, different things like that. We put polis at the end, meaning city. So at the same time, the Greeks shared a common culture based on their language, religious beliefs, traditions, and close economic ties. So they were separated by geography, but this is what was all the same. So all Greeks believe in the same gods and goddesses, including Zeus, Athena, and Apollo, who are believed to live on Mount Olympus. Their myths, such as the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece and the Siege of Troy, are still around today. People still read those myths. So citizens from all Greek city-states participated every 4 years in the Olympic Games in honor of Zeus and other Greek gods. The Greeks believed that their gods were pleased by strong, graceful human beings. So that's why they had the Olympics. And here's a picture of Mount Olympus. And one of the first ones was Sparta. So one of the most important city-states was Sparta. It was located on the southern part of Greece, so down at the bottom of the peninsula. And that peninsula is Peloponnesian. And in 725 BC, the Spartans conquered their neighbors, and they forced these people known as the Helots to farm for them. And this kind of starts their culture. Is they they constantly had to force this. They had to use force to maintain control of the Helots, so they became a very, very militaristic culture. So due to this threat, life in Sparta was organized around military needs. So individualism and new ideas were discouraged, and strict obedience and self-discipline were highly valued. So it's almost like going into the military and going through your basic training. That's kind of how they lived. So one of the examples of how extreme it was is if a newborn Spartan baby was found to be unhealthy, it was left on the hillside to die. So they kept the strongest children and things like that, and they became very important. So the other major city-state is Athens, and it developed a unique system of government, which we still have today. So every citizen could participate in government directly by voting on issues, and the main governing body of Athens was called the Citizens' Assembly. So it's kind of like their government. So it was open to all citizens, but only the first 5,000 or so citizens who gathered could attend the meetings. It met regularly and at least 10 times a year, and the assembly directed foreign policy and made laws. So citizens who served on the council, jury, or as magistrates were paid reimbursement for the days that they lost from work. This ensured that even poor citizens could participate in government. So this type of government, which Athens was first to introduce, is known as democracy. And in a democracy, ordinary citizens participate in the government either directly or by elected representatives. And democracy just means rule of the people. So in Athens, only a minority of the residents were actually citizens. So we keep talking about citizens, but this was a small group of people who were considered citizens. So women, foreigners, and slaves were not citizens and could not participate in government. So how was the Athenian democracy different from the American democracy today? We elect representatives who go and vote for us most of the time, to where the Athenian democracy was a direct democracy where that assembly, that group of people voted for everything directly. So a little bit different from our democracy. All right, so the Persian War. So in the 5th century BC, the Persian Empire tried to conquer the Greek city-states. Surprisingly, the Persians failed. So after the war, the Greeks enjoyed a golden age, and Pericles he championed democracy. He was the leader of Athens. And what he did was he collected revenues from other city-states to rebuild Athens, because Athens had been destroyed by the Persian Empire. This huge empire, loses to the Greeks, but it did destroy Athens and other cities. So the golden age of Greek culture. Art, literature, and philosophy all flourished during this time. And in philosophy, the Greeks believed that human reason was powerful enough to understand the world and to solve problems. A series of 3 philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, asked important questions and tried to find answers. So Socrates questioned his student about moral terms. So he would ask him, what is goodness? What is morality? What is justice? And in 399 BC, Socrates actually, his enemies actually persuaded the Athenian council that he was corrupting the students, and he was condemned to death for corrupting the young in Greece. So Plato took Socrates' method and took it a little bit farther. He concluded that values like goodness, beauty, and justice actually exist independent ideas and are more real than the changing appearances that we see in daily life. So in the Republic, Plato described an ideal city-state, and it would be ruled by philosopher kings instead of your religious leaders or just through family hereditary. So he defined justice as the rule of reason over appetite. So justice is when you have reason and you can overcome your desires. So his most famous student, Aristotle, was less concerned about these abstract concepts that that Plato had talked about earlier on. And then what made Aristotle a little bit different is he collected and classified things from animals to city-states, constitutions, and he studied their relationships. So he kind of put everything in classifications, and then he would study how they were different. So art and architecture, Greek sculptors and architects tried to design statues and buildings to ideal proportions. So they tried to make people look perfect in what they thought was perfect. So Greek buildings and statues were not the white marble that we see today in museums. They were brightly painted with bold colors. And the Parthenon, which is a splendid marble temple with beautiful columns, which I showed you at the beginning, was constructed on the hill known as the Acropolis, and inside was a giant statue of Athena, who was the patron goddess of the city. Science and mathematics. All right. So geographers like Eratosthenes, I don't know if I've gotten that correct, so that the earth was round, and he actually calculated the circumference of the earth. He also used a device called the sieve in discovering all prime numbers up to any limit. So he could discover prime numbers from math. Archimedes is considered one of the greatest mathematicians of antiquity, which is ancient Greece. He was also a practical man who studied levers, pulleys, which we'll see here in just a little bit. He measured volume and density, designed catapults, and he invented a large screw-like device that would actually pump water from a lower area into an area that was elevated. And then music and literature. Greeks listened to choral music and instruments a lot like what we have today. So they had the string lyre, they had the flute, they developed musical scales, and Greek historians like Herodotus and Theocles, again, not sure if I'm pronouncing that even close, told the story of the past. So Greek playwrights like Sophocles completed the first known comedies and tragedies. They kind of had just two. They either had a comedy or a drama. And the Greeks watched these plays in your big open amphitheaters, which we kind of still copy today. And here's some of the Greek art. Again, straight columns, no arches. This would be a Spartan vase. This is probably also Spartan. And here it is today in ruins. So this is the Parthenon sitting on top of the Acropolis. And this is actually a complete replica of it done in Athens, Georgia. Here's the marble statues. You can see they tried to make the body perfect. And here's some different inventions that they had. This one actually would tell you how far a distance was. So this is actually, charting, say, for us would be how long the road is and how many miles. This was actually like an alarm clock. It had drops of water that filled up, and once it filled up high enough, it overturned the bucket, and the bucket had stones in it and it made a loud noise, so you knew the different times during the day. And then this is pretty much a large crossbow. It's about as big as a crossbow as you can get. Here's the levers and pulleys that they use. Here's a type of guitar that they use, and then here's that device that actually pulled water from lower areas into elevated areas, and here's a good picture of it. It's still used in some places today. All right, the Peloponnesian War. So a rivalry soon developed between Athens and Sparta. The Athenians had used their power to force some of the other city-states to pay them taxes. Sparta got tired of it. They declared war on Athens, and it started the Peloponnesian War, Peloponnesian being the peninsula of Peloponnesia. So after 30 years of fighting, Sparta emerged as the victor, and the Peloponnesian War greatly weakened both of the Greek city-states. So the economic costs were considerable. Poverty became widespread. Athens was devastated again, and then Sparta ends up as the leading city-state. So women in ancient Greece. So in ancient Greece, men generally regarded women as inferior and excluded them from public life. They didn't even really go out to get water or things like that. So women managed the home, and they were subject to their husband's will. They had to do whatever the husband said. Spartan women were different than a lot of the other women in Greece. They enjoyed a greater status, and many of them were given an education, physical training. They had to. So they had to be prepared for battle almost. So Athenian women could own clothing and slaves, but could not own their own land or enter into contracts, which was a big deal back then. And this is some of the dress back then. All right, Alexander the Great. In 338 BC, the king of Macedonia, an area located north of Greece, brought all the Greek city-states under his control. And his son, Alexander the Great, eventually will take over for him. And Alexander the Great is taught by Aristotle, one of the philosophers that we already talked about. So Alexander went on to conquer most of the Mediterranean world, including all the way to Egypt and Persia. His conquest took him as far as the Indus River Valley. Alexander ends up dying at a young age after he gets to the Indus River Valley, and quickly the empire falls apart. But he starts what's called the Hellenistic culture. So wherever Alexander went, he took the great Greek ideas and great Greek culture, and he spread it throughout the territories that he conquered. So his followers were absorbed in Eastern ideas and styles, and the Hellenistic culture is actually a fusion of the Greek cultures and the Middle East and India, the best of all three. So the greatest Hellenistic achievements were in mathematics and science, and Alexander's construction of the Great Library at Alexandria encouraged scholarship. And the Hellenistic sculptors were a little bit different from the Greek. They actually wanted to put more emotional representation in art. So the statues and heads of ordinary people would actually be done. So it would show their imperfections. They didn't try and make them perfect like the Greeks. And many of the wealthy members of society, including women, began to study philosophy and to attend lectures and popular philosophers, lectures done by popular philosophers. So the women had a little bit more freedom under the Hellenistic culture. So this is how big it was, huge area. And it goes from Persia, Syria, Egypt, and then where he eventually came from, Macedonia and Greece. So some of the achievements were democracy, which came from Athens, science and math, all the different things that we talked about. Literature and history, they wrote down their history. They had the Greek plays, things like that. Philosophy, remember the three Greek philosophers. And then art and architecture, the Greeks tried to make things perfect. Okay, and a great example is the Parthenon and the marble statues and things like that the Greeks had.